Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
On my birthday, my dad handed my brother the keys to a brand new Corvette, smiled like a man who'd just solved world peace, and said, "You'll get your turn eventually." I didn't say anything. I just sat there at the far end of the long table, the one we'd reserved at Sullivan's Steakhouse, the kind of place where every man over 50 orders the same thing and calls it rare enough to moo. I watched my younger brother, Chris, who was practically glowing in the soft amber light, hold up the keys like he'd won a Nobel Prize, instead of just being born with a jawline and a penis. My dad patted him on the back with this proud look in his eyes that I hadn't seen once directed toward me in the past 10 years, maybe longer. Chris grinned, soaked in the applause from our cousins and uncles and friends of friends we hadn't seen in years, most of whom didn't even know the dinner was for both our birthdays. His was just 2 weeks before mine, so they lumped us together for convenience. But make no mistake, the night was his. The spotlight had already picked a side. I stayed quiet even when my mom, sitting across from me, opened the plain white envelope that had my name scribbled on it. I hadn't looked inside yet, because honestly, I hadn't expected anything beyond a gift card, or maybe some sentimental Hallmark message she'd pretend to care about. But the moment she slid the paper out and read it, her face went pale like she'd just seen someone walk in who wasn't supposed to be alive. She folded it back up almost immediately, but not fast enough for me to miss the tremor in her hand. No one else noticed. Chris was still holding court, still laughing too loudly, still promising to let the old man take it for a spin. It wasn't the car that got to me. I don't even like flashy things. I drive a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked rear window and a prayer for a suspension system. What hit me that night wasn't envy, it was clarity. That feeling like the air in the room shifted just a few inches to the left, and suddenly you realize you've been breathing in something toxic for years without even knowing it. That envelope didn't just ruin the night. It cracked something open that I'd kept sealed shut for decades. Growing up, Chris was always the golden boy. I mean that in the literal sense. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the athletic build that made him the star quarterback, and the kind of magnetic confidence that made adults forgive every dumb thing he did. He crashed a jet ski into the dock at Lake Travis when he was 17 and still got a new one for graduation. I once got grounded for bringing home a B+ in geometry. That's the kind of scoreboard we were working with. And yet, I never made noise about it. I moved out at 20, put myself through nursing school by waiting tables and cleaning houses, and when I bought my own condo last year, no one in the family even asked to see it. They still send all my mail to my childhood home. I'm not kidding. So that night, when my dad toasted to Chris, the future of the family business, and then looked around as if that was some kind of profound benediction, I did what I'd always done. I smiled politely and raised my glass. I didn't say, "You realize I've worked full-time since I was 19, while Chris is still trying to find a job that doesn't start before 10. I didn't mention that I helped Mom recover after her knee surgery, while Chris couldn't take off work from his fantasy football league. I just clinked glasses with whoever was closest, chewed through my sirloin, and nodded through another story about Chris's college years, even though he dropped out after 3 semesters and somehow spun it into a strategic pivot. I don't know what made me look back down at that envelope after dessert. Maybe it was the way Mom kept glancing at me with that strained half smile, the kind she used when she was holding in a secret or about to lie. Maybe it was instinct. I opened it after the plates were cleared, while the table had thinned out and Chris was outside taking photos with the car. Inside wasn't a card. It was a legal-looking document. One single sheet of cream paper with black text. No signature, no letterhead. Just a sentence that read like it had been ripped from a courtroom drama. Document enclosed confirms request made to release contents of safe deposit box number 312, First Union Bank, per access authorization dated April 14, 2005. That was it. No explanation, no instructions, just that. And suddenly my mom's reaction made sense, because that wasn't a birthday card. That was a breadcrumb. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in bed fully dressed, with my laptop open and Google Maps zoomed in on the old First Union branch in Marble Falls. It was almost 3 hours away, in a town I hadn't set foot in since my grandmother's funeral. She died when I was 21, and I remember vividly how fast Dad took control of the estate. How the family barely had time to grieve before he was moving paperwork through like a man on a mission. He never liked her much. She always treated me different, better, honestly, quieter praise, bigger hugs, slipped me $20 bills when no one was looking, and called me her girl. When she passed, she left behind a lot of confusion. There had been rumors she had money, oil shares, some land, something like that, but nothing ever came of it. Dad said it all went to cover expenses. I never questioned it, until now. I knew I wasn't supposed to have access to that box. I knew I was going to need to find out how I got authorized. But more than anything, I knew one thing with absolute clarity that night. Sitting in my quiet apartment with the heater clicking like it always does when it's about to die, I was done waiting for my turn. I wasn't going to ask questions nicely. I wasn't going to assume it was all a misunderstanding. No, something about that paper and my mom's pale face and the complete certainty in my father's voice as he said, "You'll get your turn eventually," flipped a switch. Because what if I was never meant to get a turn? What if the game had been rigged since the beginning? What if that envelope, that single unremarkable sheet of paper, wasn't just a mistake, but a warning that someone, somewhere, had finally pulled the wrong string? And what if they'd underestimated just how far I was willing to go? To untangle the rest of it, I closed my laptop, set my alarm for 6, and laid back on the bed fully dressed. As I stared at the ceiling, the only thing I could think was this. Let's see what's inside that box. By the time morning came, I had already rehearsed the conversation with my mother at least 20 different ways in my head. And every version of it ended in her either denying everything outright or pretending she had no idea what I was talking about. Which meant that when I finally walked into her kitchen just after 8, while she was still in her bathrobe and sipping her usual lukewarm coffee with too much powdered creamer and that tired, distracted look on her face, I already knew this wasn't going to be one of those heartwarming moments where long-held secrets are confessed over tea and everything ends in a hug. I didn't waste time with small talk, didn't ask about her knee, didn't comment on the weather or bring up last night's dinner. I simply slid the envelope across the table and asked, in the calmest voice I could manage, "Do you want to tell me what this is?" Her fingers didn't move right away, but her eyes betrayed her, flicking to the envelope and then back to my face like she was calculating something she hadn't had to think about in years. And I knew then, with absolute certainty, that she had known exactly what it was the second she opened it at the restaurant. She didn't pick it up, didn't unfold it, just stared at it like it might explode. Then she exhaled through her nose and said, too casually to be anything but rehearsed, "It's probably just something your grandmother forgot to close out. You know how she was, always clinging to old papers." That moment, right then, right there, was when I understood that this wasn't just about old bank forms or forgotten documents or some quirky, posthumous detail left behind by an eccentric relative. This was deeper, much deeper, something that had been buried on purpose and left to rot under the assumption that no one would ever come looking because the people involved assumed, foolishly, that I would never bother. I watched my mother's fingers twitch on the coffee mug, the way her knuckles turned white for just a second too long, and I realized I'd spent most of my life thinking she was the softer one, the kinder parent, the more reasonable of the two, but that was only because she was quieter about her betrayals. I didn't press her. I didn't give her the satisfaction of an argument. I stood up, thanked her for the coffee I hadn't touched, and left her sitting there with her lies and her bathrobe and her silence. By noon, I was halfway to Marble Falls with the heater barely working and the GPS cutting in and out. But the idea of turning around never once crossed my mind, because something inside me had shifted. Something that had been dormant for far too long. Maybe rage, maybe curiosity, maybe just the final snap of that little part of me that had still held on to the belief that if I worked hard and stayed polite, eventually my family would see me. I pulled into the bank parking lot just before 2, the same building I remembered from my childhood, although now it looked older, more sterile. like someone had drained it of all its color. The woman at the counter was polite but skeptical when I asked about the safe deposit box. I told her I didn't have the key, that I'd lost it years ago, and her eyes immediately narrowed in that way people do when they're trained to look for trouble, but also too tired to deal with it. She asked for ID, proof of relation, anything that would show I had a legitimate claim, and I gave her everything I had, including my driver's license, a copy of my birth certificate, and an old letter addressed to me from my grandmother that I'd kept in my glove compartment for reasons I never fully understood until that moment. She made some calls, disappeared into the back for almost 20 minutes, and then returned with a man in a gray suit who introduced himself as the branch manager. His name was Alan, and he spoke like someone who had just come from a meeting about budget cuts and didn't really want to be involved in whatever this was. But he eventually led me into a small, windowless room and told me that, yes, my name had been added to the access list for box number 312 in April of 2005, and that the original holder, my grandmother, had specifically included a clause allowing me to gain access in the event of her death, regardless of whether I possessed a key. The legal jargon was thick, but the point was clear. She had planned for this. He handed me gloves, a pen, and a clipboard, then unlocked the drawer and slid it forward without a word. I stared at the long metal box for a few seconds before opening it, and when I finally did, my heart didn't race the way I expected it to. It slowed down. I was suddenly very calm, like my body knew what was coming even if my brain hadn't caught up yet. Inside were several neatly stacked envelopes, 2 small velvet jewelry boxes, a folded cloth pouch tied with string, and 1 thick manila folder labeled simply Rachel. I ignored everything else and opened the folder. The first page was a handwritten letter in my grandmother's shaky cursive, dated 6 months before she died. It started with "My dearest girl," which hit me harder than I cared to admit, and then continued into something that felt part confession, part apology, and part instruction manual for a bomb she'd left behind for someone else to find. She wrote about my father, or rather, the man I called my father, and how he'd never fully accepted me, not because I wasn't good enough, but because I wasn't his. She never gave names, only said that my mother had made a choice to protect me, and that the truth had been buried because men like your father don't forgive, and they certainly don't forget. There was a copy of a birth certificate buried deeper in the folder, one with my name and a different father listed, someone I'd never heard of, a name that didn't mean anything to me at the time, but that would soon become the centerpiece of everything I thought I knew. Underneath the letter and the certificate was a sealed envelope labeled "Will Final," and that's when my breath did catch, because I realized what this was. This was the real will. The one we were never supposed to see. The one that left everything, not just trinkets and keepsakes, but the oil shares, the land deeds, the remaining bonds, and whatever was left of my grandmother's modest fortune, entirely to me. I sat there for I don't know how long, just holding that envelope, letting the weight of it press into my palms like a question I didn't know how to answer. All those years I spent thinking my grandmother had nothing left to give, that everything had been eaten up by medical bills and probate lawyers and some generic version of loss. None of it had been true. My dad hadn't just hidden this, he had stolen it. And my mother, whether willingly or under pressure, had helped him do it. By the time I walked out of the bank, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the lot. And I felt like I was walking out of a vault. Not just the metal kind, but the emotional kind. The one where I'd stored every hurt, every slight, every moment I'd swallowed down and tried to ignore, in the name of family unity. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next, but I knew this much for sure. My father didn't forget me on my birthday. He never planned for me to be remembered in the first place, and now that I knew the truth, I wasn't going to forget him either. I didn't drive straight home after leaving the bank, and it wasn't because I needed more time to process what I had just uncovered, though that was certainly part of it, but because I knew deep in my gut that once I returned to the city, once I crossed that familiar stretch of highway, and merge back into the routines of a life I had built for myself from the ground up, I would never again see things the same way. And I needed, just for a few more hours, to stay in that quiet liminal space between knowing and acting, between revelation and retribution, a place where the world had shifted but hadn't yet forced me to respond. I stopped at a grim little diner off Route 281, one of those places where the floor tiles are yellowed and cracked and the waitress doesn't write anything down but still gets your order wrong. And I sat there for nearly an hour, sipping weak coffee and staring at the folder on the seat beside me, trying to connect the facts as they stood against the history I'd lived through and assumed, wrongly, to be true. I kept thinking about the stories my father told at family gatherings, always loud and confident, always the hero in his own retelling, and I began to realize how much of our family's mythology had been constructed around his version of reality. How many decisions had been justified by his authority, how many narratives had been shaped by his disdain for anything that didn't center him or his golden son, and how much silence had been enforced by my mother's passive complicity. The will in my hand was real, signed, dated, legally binding, and authenticated by a notary who had included her business card and a photocopy of her license, and yet no one had mentioned it when my grandmother passed. There had been no reading, no challenge, no estate discussions. The whole thing had been wrapped up in a matter of weeks, with my father claiming there was nothing left but debts and confusion. A process so abrupt and controlled that it had barely registered at the time as anything more than efficient. But now, with the clarity of hindsight and the physical proof in front of me, I could see it for what it truly was: a calculated erasure, a deliberate theft carried out by people who had spent their lives pretending to be trustworthy simply because they wore the right clothes and spoke with the right tones and signed birthday cards with just enough warmth to avoid suspicion. The jewelry boxes from the safe deposit box had contained heirloom pieces I remembered vaguely from childhood, rings my grandmother never took off, a brooch I once saw her wear at a church luncheon, a string of pearls she had called ugly but expensive. And while those things mattered sentimentally, they paled in comparison to the documents tucked beneath them, which laid out, in exhaustive detail, an estate valued at nearly 7 figures, not including the mineral rights to a piece of land in West Texas that had been leased to a drilling company since the late 1990s. I spent the next 2 days combing through everything, scanning and photocopying every page, organizing the paperwork into a timeline that made it impossible to ignore what had happened. The land had been sold 6 months after my grandmother's death, the shares liquidated the following year, and the money, close to $800,000 according to the brokerage statements, had been deposited into a business account under my father's name. The same account I would later find used to finance the expansion of his HVAC business, which just so happened to list my brother Chris as co-owner despite the fact that he had never lifted a wrench in his life. There were no transfers to my mother, no trust established in my name, no attempt to adhere to the stipulations of the original will, which clearly stated that the entirety of the estate was to be placed into a living trust for me, with specific provisions for delayed withdrawal to protect against external influence, a phrase I now understood to mean my father. I knew I couldn't go straight to court with what I had. Statutes of limitations, probate rules, and the simple fact that challenging a will years after the estate had been closed would require a level of proof and persistence I wasn't yet ready to summon. But I also knew I wasn't going to let it go. I made copies of everything, stored them in 3 different places: my apartment, my office locker, and a password-protected cloud drive. And then I called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year. Jenna, a former college roommate turned paralegal, who had once told me, during a tequila-fueled conversation on a beach in Corpus Christi, that everyone should have at least one lawyer in their pocket, just in case life turned sideways. I explained the situation, sent her the documents, and waited, nervous and angry and vibrating with a kind of restrained rage that felt new and exhilarating in its sharpness. When she called me back the next afternoon, her voice was measured but curious, the way someone sounds when they're watching a minor car crash they can't look away from. She confirmed that, yes, the will looked legitimate, and yes, what my father had done likely constituted fraud, at best unethical, at worst criminal, but that pursuing it would be difficult, expensive, and drawn out, unless I was willing to play a different kind of game. That's when the idea began to form. Not a lawsuit, not a public scandal, but a quiet, methodical dismantling of the carefully curated life my father had built for himself. On top of a lie, a slow unspooling of every string he had tied into a knot and called legacy. I started small. I made an anonymous tip to the Texas State Board of Professional Engineers and Land Surveyors, citing irregularities in the mineral rights transfer forms that bore his name, claiming forged notary signatures and mismatched dates. I didn't need the complaint to stick, just to raise enough suspicion to trigger a review. Next, I used a burner phone and a prepaid card to set up a private email account under a fake name and began sending carefully worded messages to my father's accountant. Questions about tax discrepancies, off-the-books income, and unreported asset sales. Again, I didn't need to prove anything. I just needed to plant seeds of doubt in the right places, to make him sweat, to remind him that secrets have a way of leaking when you least expect them to. Then, for the first time since this all began, I allowed myself to imagine what it might look like to let Chris know the truth. Not all at once, not directly, but in fragments, in the kind of subtle insinuations that make a person question the foundations of their privilege. I created a new email address, composed a single sentence, "You've built your life on a stolen fortune, and the rightful heir is watching," and sent it to his company inbox. No subject line, no explanation. He didn't reply, of course, but I saw on LinkedIn that he updated his profile the next day, removing the co-owner title and reverting to sales manager. A small change, but it told me everything I needed to know. He was rattled. They both were. I wasn't done, not by a long shot, but the taste of that first victory, that tiny unraveling of the smug, untouchable confidence they'd both worn like armor for so many years, was enough to sustain me. I had thought I wanted closure, or maybe justice, but what I really wanted, what I had always wanted, without knowing it, was to watch them squirm under the weight of their own lies, to force them to live with the same uncertainty and powerlessness they had so generously bestowed upon me. So I poured myself a glass of wine, opened my laptop, and began drafting the next move. If they wanted to steal from a ghost, then it was only fair that the ghosts learned how to haunt. It didn't happen all at once, and it certainly didn't unfold in the dramatic Hollywood-style explosion I might have once imagined in my angriest moments. Instead, what followed was a slow, deliberate unraveling that started in small, almost imperceptible ways. A voicemail left too long unanswered, an awkward silence in a conversation that used to flow too easily, a clipped tone that hinted at discomfort where there used to be automatic confidence. And like a woman standing on the shore watching the tide recede farther than it should, I knew with a strange, almost electric certainty that something larger, something darker, was about to be revealed by the receding calm. After I sent that first email to Chris, the one-liner that barely hinted at anything but struck directly at the throat of his imagined security, I waited with a patience I hadn't known I possessed, knowing instinctively that he would say nothing to me, that he wouldn't risk confrontation, because confrontation would mean exposing his own ignorance, admitting he didn't know what I was talking about. And Chris, despite his smug exterior and his long-cultivated image of breezy confidence, had always been more insecure than anyone realized, especially when it came to Dad. The two of them shared something I had never been invited into, a sort of unspoken pact made up of expectations, unearned praise, and constant reinforcement that Chris was the chosen one, the heir apparent, the one who mattered. And I had no doubt that, faced with even the slightest implication that his status had been built on a lie, he would go straight to the source. I imagined the conversation easily, Chris marching into my father's office, not with anger, but with that trademark blend of confusion and entitlement, asking casually if there was something going on, maybe even flashing the email from his phone, and watching my father's reaction closely, the way we had both learned to do over the years, because our father was the kind of man who never lost control at all, unless it suited him, a man whose real tells weren't in what he said, but in how long he paused before saying it. And whatever that pause looked like, whatever words followed it, I knew they wouldn't be enough, not this time. The shift began with Dad himself, though of course he didn't realize anyone was watching. He started making changes, small ones, adjustments to his routine, to the way he talked to people, even to the language he used around the house when he thought no one was paying attention. My mother noticed first. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice soft and strangely hesitant, the way it got when she was trying to be maternal but didn't quite remember how. "He's been acting off," she said, drawing the word out like she was testing it in her mouth. "Jumpier than usual. He snapped at Chris yesterday over something stupid, and he keeps taking phone calls outside." I didn't respond right away because I wasn't sure if this was her way of opening the door to a real conversation, or just another attempt to test the waters without committing to the swim. She was a master of passive concern, a woman who had spent her entire adult life learning how to exist in the shadows of someone else's dominance, and while I had grown used to her silences, to her well-meaning but ultimately hollow attempts at connection, this was the first time she'd reached out with something that resembled alarm. When I finally did speak, I kept my tone even. Maybe he's finally realizing the past doesn't stay buried forever. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't need to. The silence on the other end of the line told me she'd already guessed, maybe even known, what I had uncovered, and I almost laughed at how predictable it all was. How the woman who had once sworn to protect me had chosen instead to protect her place in the family, her status, her convenience, all while pretending that she had done it for my sake. Over the next few weeks, I escalated things, not recklessly, not impulsively, but with the same cold, strategic mindset I had once envied in courtroom dramas. That slow burn intelligence that waits for the perfect opening and then sinks in the knife so gently the victim doesn't even realize they're bleeding until it's far too late to stop the damage. I knew my father's business, knew its weak points, knew how it functioned, how it failed, how often he dipped into personal accounts to float payroll, and how frequently he used tax loopholes to shift funds around in ways that wouldn't survive real scrutiny. I drafted a packet, anonymous, of course, of documents, summaries, and flagged transactions, and I sent them to the compliance officer at the company's largest client, a mid-sized construction firm that accounted for nearly 40% of my father's annual revenue. I didn't accuse him of anything outright. I simply asked a question. Had they reviewed the latest subcontractor filings? Were they aware of some unusual payment activity? The response was exactly what I had hoped for. Within 10 days, the company announced it was launching an internal audit of its vendor partnerships, a phrase that sounded innocuous to anyone not in the industry, but which, in this case, meant my father would be getting a very uncomfortable call and would spend the next several weeks poring over paperwork with a pit in his stomach and a legal pad full of increasingly desperate notes. From a distance, it looked like nothing at all, just a normal business hiccup. But I knew better. I knew the way he panicked when he wasn't in control. The calls from my mother became more frequent after that. Always vague, always tinged with unspoken questions she didn't quite know how to ask. "He's been drinking more," she said during one conversation, her voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. "And last night he yelled at the TV, not the news, just the TV." I offered her nothing, no comfort, no answers. I didn't tell her that I had mailed her a copy of the real will a week earlier, carefully packaged in an unmarked envelope with no return address, knowing full well she would recognize the handwriting on the original document, the notary seal, the intent. I wanted her to see it. I wanted her to sit with it, to stare down the truth and understand what she had helped destroy. Meanwhile, Chris went quiet. No calls, no texts, not even the performative Happy Tuesday memes he used to send out like clockwork. I checked his social media accounts, and while he hadn't deleted anything, he had stopped posting almost entirely, and a little digging revealed that his girlfriend had unfollowed him on every platform and removed their anniversary post. Something had cracked open in his world, and while I couldn't be sure exactly what he had confronted my father about, I knew that whatever version of the truth had leaked out, it was enough to unsettle his foundation. The beautiful part of it all, the part I savored in moments of quiet satisfaction, was that I hadn't even told them everything yet. They didn't know the full extent of what I had. They didn't know about the trust account I was in the process of resurrecting, or the quiet inquiries I had sent to a probate attorney who specialized in posthumous will disputes, or the upcoming meeting I had scheduled with someone who, until recently, I hadn't even known existed. Because while they scrambled to protect what they thought was at risk, the money, the business, the reputation, I was already moving past them, already planning my exit from the story they had tried to write me out of, already crafting the narrative that would leave them behind in the ashes of their own design. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was breathing fresh air. For the first time, I wasn't the background character in a family epic built on bullshit and convenience. I was the one holding the pen, and I was done waiting for my chapter to begin. It was strange, really, how quickly life could reassemble itself once the emotional debris had been cleared away. Once the truth, no matter how jagged or unwelcome, had been laid bare across the floor like broken glass, sharp and undeniable, impossible to step around without drawing blood. After weeks of calculated nudges, subtle disclosures, and well-placed whispers, I had expected some dramatic confrontation, a final blowout in which everything spilled into the open in one chaotic rush. But instead, what came was silence, thick and suffocating, the kind that settles in when people have finally realized they are not just wrong, but exposed. And worse still, powerless to undo what's already been put in motion. In the weeks that followed the audit, the unraveling gained speed in ways even I hadn't anticipated. My father, once so meticulously composed and endlessly sure of his control over every conversation, every detail, every member of his tightly curated orbit, had begun to fracture publicly. He was spotted more than once leaving his office midday, red-faced and disoriented, yelling into his phone as though volume alone could erase the web of consequences closing in around him. The construction firm quietly severed ties, citing contractual reevaluation, and while he tried to spin the narrative as a mutual decision based on shifting priorities, word traveled quickly in small industries, and soon other clients followed suit, not in dramatic fashion, but with the quiet efficiency of people who didn't want to get caught holding onto a sinking ship. Chris, on the other hand, had disappeared into what I can only describe as a shame spiral, though whether the shame was over what he'd learned or simply that his illusions had been stripped away, I couldn't be sure. I never told him the full truth, not directly, not with the clarity he might have wanted, but I did send one final message, this time not through a burner phone or an anonymous address, but from my personal email with my full name, my new signature, and a scanned copy of the will's front page attached. It wasn't about the money, not anymore. It was about acknowledgement, about reclaiming something that had been stolen long before cash ever changed hands. The message was simple. You can keep the car. I already got the inheritance. I never heard back, and I didn't expect to, because the truth wasn't something Chris was built to handle. It wasn't something that fit inside the neat little framework he'd always used to navigate the world. A framework where effort was optional, consequences were distant, and love, loyalty, and recognition flowed freely in his direction without the burden of reciprocation. My mother, who had once called every Sunday with rigid consistency, hadn't phoned since the will arrived. Not a single word, not even a text. I thought about reaching out, if only to demand some version of an apology, but eventually, I realized I no longer needed one. Whatever fantasy version of her I'd clung to had dissolved in the quiet. Her loyalty, her softness, her motherhood itself, all shown to be conditional, conveniently deployed when it benefited her image or preserved the family peace, but absent when I truly needed her strength. She had made her choice a long time ago, even if she'd convinced herself she hadn't. But the most unexpected turn, the thread I hadn't planned on pulling, not at first, came when I finally decided to investigate the name listed on my birth certificate. The man who, according to the document, had fathered me. It had always been just a name, a string of letters that felt more fictional than factual, tucked between legal jargon and handwritten corrections. But after all the secrets that had come to light, I couldn't leave that last piece unanswered, not anymore. It took some digging, old voter registrations, public records, archived phone directories, but eventually I found him. Walter L. Bennett, age 63, retired construction manager, living just 2 towns over in a modest house tucked behind a gas station and a strip mall. I drove there on a Thursday afternoon, not really sure what I would say or if I'd even knock on the door, but when I saw him through the window, hunched over a newspaper with a half-empty coffee cup in front of him, something settled inside me. I walked up the steps, knocked once, and waited. He opened the door slowly, cautiously, the way people do when they're not expecting visitors, and have learned that unexpected knocks rarely bring good news. I introduced myself. I told him my name, and before I could even finish explaining why I was there, his expression shifted. Not to surprise, exactly, but to something softer, something more like recognition or maybe even guilt. He invited me in, without questions, without hesitation, and we sat at his kitchen table for almost 2 hours while he told me everything. He hadn't known, not really. He said my mother had told him to stay away, that she was marrying someone else, someone stable, someone already in the picture. He'd respected her wishes, moved on, built a life, got clean, stayed out of trouble. He had a wife now, grown kids, a quiet life. He didn't cry when I told him about my childhood, didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't make excuses, but he listened, really listened. And when I pulled the photo of my grandmother out of my bag, the one I'd found in the safe deposit box, he stared at it for a long time and said, "She was a good woman. She always tried to do what was right." That was enough for me. I didn't need more. I left that house with a photo, a phone number, and an open invitation for coffee. Whenever you feel like you've got space for it, which, in its own quiet way, felt more meaningful than any parade of apologies or declarations of love. When I got home that evening, I stood in the middle of my apartment, surrounded by a life I had built with my own hands, with no shortcuts, no inheritance, no stolen money to smooth the edges, and I realized that the revenge, while deeply satisfying, wasn't the real win. The real win was that I had walked away with my dignity intact, with the truth in my pocket, and with no more illusions tying me to people who had only loved me when it was convenient. I spent the weekend packing up a few boxes, not because I needed to run, but because I had finally outgrown the version of myself that had waited for crumbs, that had smiled politely at family dinners while being slowly erased, that had hoped, foolishly, that blood would be enough to make people behave with decency. Before I left town, I dropped one final letter into the mail, addressed to my father, no return address, no sender name. Inside was a copy of the full will, the trust paperwork, and a sticky note with a single sentence. "You always said I'd get my turn." And then beneath it, in smaller handwriting, "I just took it back. He'll read it, he'll know what it means, and he'll live with it. Because some gifts don't come wrapped in bows or topped with keys. Some gifts come in silence, in truth, in the power to walk away whole, while the people who broke you sit in the ruins of the lie they built. And I'm done waiting."